Gamers, how's it going? We got to do a tier list today. I haven't done one in about a month. I like to do them about every month since the format, tends to change about every month. And I would say at this point, I'm familiar enough with the format to be able to talk about it. So look, as I like to do usually with my tier list, we can start with what I believe to be the top tier. So let's not mess around here. The top tier, in my opinion, is Ubel and Fire King, right? I think we can all agree with that. Ubel, Fire King, best decks in the game. Ubel, being able to set up a monster negate before you really even get into your plays, is pretty terrifying and honestly kind of annoying sometimes. Also, the fact that they have this like Mekonko effect, making it really, really hard to out them. It's really hard to beat into them because obviously you need to deal with Nightmare Pain, and they can also just crash into whatever board you set up and just go for game. So that means that going second, they're also really, really good at baiting out interruption and then just crashing if they can like summon 2 to 3 Ubels on the field and just go for lethal that way. So Ubel, incredibly well situated, in my opinion, best deck in ladder. Now do keep in mind these tier lists that I make are always focused on the ladder format. I don't really participate in tournaments. I don't follow them very much, so I'm more so focused on the competitive ladder aspect of Master Duel in general. So just keep that in mind. I don't know for tournaments like if maybe Fire King is better. I don't know if like in a best of 3 format or like having access to siding, if that makes a big difference. That being said, Fire King Snake Eyes is very, very close, and I would say they're almost interchangeable. Honestly, like I could understand arguments for either deck being the best. Fire King Snake Eyes having pretty much the most insane grind game, plays quite well into max seed, like not amazing, but you can set up your stuff with fairly few summons if you're just focusing on the Fire King aspect of the deck. Then of course the consistency is there, the combos are there, the ceiling. But the one thing about it is like, Ubel gets a monster negate on field a lot of the time before they even have to get into their plays. That is absolutely insane, getting to just contact fuse a monster negate just like that for free, which like insulates you from hand traps. Whereas Fire King Snake Eyes sometimes will just lose to a hand trap if their hand isn't really equipped to deal with it. This can happen to almost any deck, and it can also happen to Ubel. It's just really crazy that Ubel does have the option sometimes of just setting up a really strong interruption like Phantom of Ubel so early. So that's why I'm edging out Ubel, but I do think like there's arguments for both of these. Now, we would be moving on to, the other tiers here. The thing is, I think there's another deck that I want to put up here. So in S tier, or I guess we'll do it like this. I'll do tier 1, 2, 3, rogue and playable. That's usually how I like to do it. I do want to put tier in tier 1. I know that's a little goofy to a lot of people. You might be looking at this like that's crazy, and I know a lot of people say, oh my god, you always have the weirdest takes for your tier list. I think this tier list is really good. You'll see by the end of it. I think without a doubt we can say Tearlament is the 3rd best deck in the game. It's extremely represented all over ladder. You can say it's high rolly, but that's not exactly true. It's actually a very, very consistent deck at getting what it needs to get. The high roll aspect comes in more so when like you're bricking or something. If you're bricked on Tearlament, you can high roll, and that can often will just save you from your bad hand. So it's more so like you get a second chance with your high roll. But in reality, Tearlament is actually a super consistent deck. Not to mention, they can play through Maxi extremely well. Their ceiling is definitely the highest out of all 3 of these decks here. And honestly, like, it's the deck I've been facing the most in Master. I think this deck, I don't know what it is. I understand that Merly's banned and that this deck got hit a bunch of times, but at this point, almost every single mill that you run in Tearlament is strong. The 60 piles are really, really good. The 40 version is also really, really good. I really don't see a world where this is not the 3rd best deck. So if you disagree with the placement of tier 1, I mean, you could say that tier is like tier 1.5, like if you wanted to. I don't want to make a tier 1.5 for a single deck. So yes, I do think this deck is worse than these two, but I do think tier is the 3rd best deck in the game. I think it's extremely well situated within the format right now and really terrifying. It's like their ceiling just doesn't end. And then there's cards like Snow that is still at 3. I could talk on and on about why I think Tearlament is so broken, but you guys have surely faced them a lot this format. I mean, I see them everywhere in Master Rank, so I feel pretty comfortable putting it here for ladder. It's good going first, good going second, good consistency, ability to like potentially like get going despite having a bad hand just by getting lucky with your mills. Like there's just so much going for this deck. So yeah, I'm putting it in tier 1. Let me know what you guys think in the comments. And now let's do, okay, we'll stick to the higher end stuff just a little longer. I'm not doing another tier 1, don't worry, but I do want to correct a mistake from my last tier list. Branded is still crazy. I'm putting it at top of tier 2, and I was this close to wanting to put it tier 1 because branded has always been extremely well suited to a best of 1 format, and despite all the hits, despite everything, it has managed to persevere and remain extremely relevant, be it in tournament results, be it in ladder. It's just incredibly strong, dude. Just getting that lock with well, we don't have the gimmick puppet anymore, right? But even if you just do it with the Jowgen, getting the Jowgen plus the trap that negates everything on the field, plus like a mirror jade, it just means that like you're guaranteed pretty much to remove whatever normal summon your opponent has to deal with your Jowgen. They're locked down. They basically can't play. It's really hard to crack branded when they're established, and they're also insanely good at going second. They have so much gas that a lot of the time, whatever you try to do, like, it's just not enough to fully interrupt them. They have like really strong non-targeting removal with like the normal summon or special summon of Albaz using like a fusion deployment. So they have a lot of different tools for different scenarios. They've always, in my opinion, been one of the best decks at a best of 1 format, and I don't know why I started thinking that it was lagging behind in previous tier lists. Clearly I was wrong. It's just so freaking good. I really don't know what else to say. I know a lot of branded players will try to gaslight me into thinking it's not this good. And, you know, like, you guys, you know, you're entitled to your opinion. But at the end of the day, the deck is still getting results after all the hits, and there's a reason for it. It is absolutely insane. So I'm putting branded at top of tier 2. It's just still crazy, you know? Now, in keeping with the theme of just putting everything at the top of their tiers to start off the list, at the top of tier 3, I'm going to be putting Centurion. So Centurion, I think, is like insane. I think a lot of people sleep on how good this deck is. A lot of people like compare it to Voiceless and stuff like that, and I don't think that's really fair. I think people are really underestimating how crazy of a card Blazer is. Not to mention they have access to other cards like Crimson Dragon, Resonator Crimson Dragon. Either way, the one that banishes everything on the field, that level 12 synchro is also really good into the Ubel matchup. This deck has tools for pretty much everything. Blazer coming back every turn makes it extremely hard to win the grind game. Keep in mind, Blazer banishes itself for cost, so even if you negate the Blazer negate on field, they will still get it back at the end phase, which basically means that you either have to shuffle it back into the deck somehow from the banish pile if you have some type of banish manipulation, or you need to find a way to remove it without letting it trigger its negate effect with like a kaiju, for example. It's really hard to out. Otherwise, you could also bait the negate and go for lethal, but it is quite hard to achieve. The deck is really resilient. It has a strong grind game with Auxilla, putting the Primera back into the back row every end phase. And again, like, I just think this deck is well situated. It's really strong. There's a reason that you see it a lot, and I think it's a little bit slept on. I'm putting it at the top of tier 3. Clearly, it's a good thing that they banned Calamity because this deck does not need it to perform in Master Rank. And now we're going to do the top of Rogue. And for the top of Rogue, I have our brand new Voiceless Voice. I think this deck is a little overrated by a lot of people. I do think there's a lot of good things going for this deck. I played a ton of it. I got to Master Rank with this deck. I ended up adding the Maximus engine, and it was really good. And I'm aware that there's a version of this deck that you can play it with branded, which I am interested in trying, and that might make me think that it's a little bit better. Like, I might end up putting it in tier 3 with the branded engine. I'm not trying that yet just because it looked a little bit scummy, and I wanted to try other different decks in the format. I've been playing a lot of Centurion lately. That being said, Voiceless has some pretty obvious weaknesses right now, mostly because of Ubel. Ubel has a crazy good matchup into Voiceless, which makes it really hard to pick a rogue deck like Voiceless in Master Rank, because you're going to get clapped by Ubel if they go first, because our deck, like, this deck is not great at going second. And then if you're going first and you get established, that's great, but your ceiling is not incredibly high unless you get the absolute full combo. And a lot of the time, Ubel can crack through and just smash into your ritual twice and just call it a day right there. It makes it really, really hard to play this deck in ladder right now. So from my experience with the deck, I really don't think it's well situated. I don't really think you can be anything above Rogue if you have like a really bad matchup into what is obviously the most popular deck in the game, aside from like, I'd say honestly, I'd say these two are the most popular decks in the game. Tearlament and Fire King, not as terrible of a matchup for this deck, but still going second into either of these strategies is really, really rough. Going first, you're most likely to win, I would say, but still, I would say even though the deck has a lot of obvious strengths, it came into a format where it wasn't really well situated, unfortunately. And finally, the Gatekeeper before Rogue, I'm putting Memento in playable. I think Memento, you know, is a great deck. It has a lot of good things going for it. It has strong one-card combos, good consistency. The one thing is the combos are pretty long-winded and quite easy to interrupt once your opponent knows where to negate. Because of that, I feel like until we get the support, it's not very realistic to put Memento above playable. It literally loses to one interruption if your opponent knows what they're doing. You negate the fusion. Most of the time that ends the turn. Even negating the Kelpie, I think it's called, the horse. Negating the horse ends the turn pretty much every time. So because of that, I would say, yeah, it's good, it's solid, but it's not quite Rogue. When we get the support, it might even go up to like tier 3 or tier 2 though. So I'm looking forward to that. I really like Memento. I think it's going to get a lot better. Now, I will say I did decide to trim a bit of the fat for this tier list because I find a lot of my tier lists, I'm talking about a lot of like pretty irrelevant decks. So like I'm like, you know what, I'm just gonna focus on decks that I'm actually seeing in ladder, or decks that are worth like discussing because they got new support in the latest set, stuff like that. So yeah, we're not gonna overcrowd the list with a bunch of decks that I haven't even seen, and I'm like kind of trying to guess where I would like situate them, you know. So with that being said, let's get into it. This one, you know, just got its support. We got Ice Barrier over here. Obviously Ice Barrier is not tier 1. It's not the best, you know, it's not the best. In fact, I would probably put it below Memento in playable. It's you know, yeah, Raiho's a good card, and you know, it's kind of a glass cannon deck. If you get set up with your Lancia, that might be enough, you know. Lancia summon Raiho, it might do the job, it might. It's just that oftentimes it won't, and oftentimes you'll have to go second, and that's when you're really going to feel the pain. Sure, you know, it has some strong cards in it, but also it doesn't have a lot of space for non-engine, or at least not enough to play with the big leagues. It also plays really poorly into Max C, as well as a bunch of other weaknesses that you'll see with a lot of these like combo synchro decks. So oh yeah, that's something I forgot to mention about like both Centurion and Voiceless. Actually, these two play pretty well into Max C. I should have mentioned that. But yeah, no, Ice Barrier plays really poorly into Max C. You know, it's not awful, it's not terrible, but it's definitely not Rogue. So we're gonna leave it here. We're gonna do the same thing for Goaty. I think Goaty is you know, it got its support. It helps a lot. It's still a 2-card combo deck that, you know, if it doesn't get set up turn 1, like the entire deck crumbles, and it's pretty easy to interrupt this deck and stop it from getting set up on turn 1, at which point you're really just grasping at straws with this deck. Now, if you do get set up, your grind game is actually really, really strong, and, you know, it can be kind of hard to stop this deck once it really gets going. That being said, it's probably a bit too slow for the current format, and I just don't think it's very well situated. Not to mention that both of these decks don't like facing Ubel at all. So yeah, that's where I'm going to leave it for that. And that's about it for the playables here. I'm not going to be putting more decks in here because there's a ton of decks that are playable in this game, and I don't want to talk about every single deck that isn't super competitive but playable, and you could get to Master 1 with it. It'll just be like a really uphill battle. I'm sure you guys have your own pet decks that you know could do it. It's just going to be challenging, right? So you can include those in this tier right here. Next up, let's do Stun. I think Stun is really good. Stun is really, really good into Ubel. It's really, really good into basically every good deck. So yeah, you're going first, you love it. You're going second, you don't love it. This won't end up being like a top of tier 3 mostly because of that. It is mostly a deck that, you know, wants to go first, get established, and win very easily. Now, one of the things that makes it a really good pick for Master Rank is that you lose quickly and you win very quickly as well. Like, you know very early into a duel if you're losing or winning. So that's kind of nice, you know, in Master Duel, because you're doing so many duels to have a deck where like your opponent is cooping like less than 2 minutes into the duel if you get fully established with stun and they don't draw the out. Your turn takes like 30 seconds when you're going first, and if you're going second, you can tell like 30 seconds into your opponent's turn if you should keep, like, if you should stick around or if you should just go next, you know? So kind of a coin flip based deck. Honestly, this whole format feels a bit more coin flip based than some of the prior formats, I would say. Like, it really feels like going first is extremely important right now. I think that's in no small part because of Ubel being a deck that you really don't want to let get established on turn 1. So, you know, it's not that different from other decks right now to have a deck that relies on going first. So yeah, I think stun at tier 3 makes a lot of sense. Now, another deck that we're going to be putting in here, let's do MATHMEECH. So MATHMEECH, I think, is tier 3. I think this deck is still really solid. I mean, it didn't lose that much. It has that insane Cyber's consistency. It has one of the best going second turns in the whole game. But unlike stun, it's weak to a good amount of hand traps, you know? Sure, you run a lot of outs to hand trap, but that doesn't mean you don't care about them, you know? So like something like a Max C is something you really don't want to see when you're playing MATHMEECH, especially the modern builds of MATHMEECH. Now, it's not necessarily the end of the world to get Max Seed with MATHMEECH. Even if you don't have the out, you know, you can like kind of pass on Super Factorial and an IP Masquerena, and that can certainly do it, you know, and you're giving your opponent, you know, like 3 to 4 draws, which isn't ideal, but you know, you're still potentially standing a chance. It's just like your odds are pretty low, you know. Doing just that going first now might not be enough for the amount of gas that like modern decks have. That being said, going second, MATHMEECH still has one of the best going second turns in the game, and so I think it's pretty well situated at tier 3, not to mention, you know, the consistency, the space for hand traps, and all these things. There's still a lot of things going for MATHMEECH, despite, you know, its couple of weaknesses. I also don't want to put it too high because people started playing Bestials again. I've been seeing Bestials a lot more, probably because tier limit has gotten so popular recently, and also because Centurion obviously always plays the Bestials, and so because of that, I feel like MATHMEECH, you know, they still hate Bestials. You still want to get your Sigma Bestialed. And so, yeah, I'm going to leave it at tier 3. I still think it's really strong. I'm putting stun above just because stun doesn't really care about most hand traps, if any, honestly. So yeah, I'm leaving it as is. Next up, we're going to go for Sprite. I think Sprite is rogue. Sprite is solid. It's not a bad deck by any means. You know, a lot of people playing the Mosquito going second, able to crash into big bodies. That being said, obviously the Mosquito play not super good into Ubel. Actually, like, you know, Sprite not that great at dealing with Ubel in general. There are variants of Sprite that play Ubel, like they play like the field spell, you know, and some basic Ubel stuff. And I've seen that, and I've lost to it, so, you know, I'm not saying it's bad or anything. I just don't think it really would be fair to put it above Rogue. It still loses to all the same stuff that a lot of Rogue decks do. If it gets Max Seed, you're passing on so little that you might as well, like, scoop almost, unless your opponent is, like, totally bricked, or you just pass on nothing and just hope that they don't have the cards that they need to actually play. Also, like, the ceiling isn't the best ever. Sprite doesn't have a bad ceiling. It just kind of has, like, a mid ceiling, I would say. Like, its combo ends up setting up a pretty good board. Nothing too crazy, nothing too oppressive, which, like, does the job a lot of the time. And again, I do think you can get to Master 1 with Sprite. It's just an uphill battle. I think the one thing making me put it in Rogue especially, well, actually, for one, it's not nearly as interruptible as the deck's Playable, you know, like it can actually play through interruption. And also going second, that Shadow Mosquito is a big deal. Like Ninja Mosquito is a really, really strong card. So because of that, because of their ability to go second, either use Gamma Burst or the Mosquito, depending on the board or the situation, I think it's pretty fair to put Sprite right here in Rogue. Next up, let's do Floowandereeze. I'm going to put Floowandereeze in tier 3 under MATHMEECH. Floowandereeze, they got some support recently, actually. We haven't talked about them yet, but Raid Raptors have a new flash spell. I forget what it's called right now, but it works very, very similar to the Floowandereeze Adventure flash spell. It's like almost the same. So basically now, Floowandereeze has 6 chances of dodging Imperm or Veiler other than, you know, like the cross out and the called by and stuff like that. So they have 6 extra chances to have a way to dodge those types of targeted interruption, or they can just use those cards also to add consistency to the deck. So that boost in consistency from those 3 extra flash spells, I think, make a pretty damn huge difference for Floowandereeze. Also, like, Floowandereeze's Book of Moon effect with their trap card is super strong against the meta, especially these two right here. Not that amazing against tier limit, to be fair. I think this is probably one of the tougher matchups for Floowandereeze in this meta, but still, I think Floowandereeze is pretty well situated right now. I'm not a fan of Floowandereeze. A lot of people know this, but I'm not going to start like lying to you. You know, I do think it's a strong deck right now. Not a bad pick at all. Now, we've been hanging out in tier 3 and Rogue and all that for quite a bit, so let's throw in a really strong deck here, but a deck I did overrate quite a bit in my last tier list, and that would be Rescue Ace. I'm going to put Rescue Ace in tier 2, and yeah, I was wrong about this deck. I'm going to be honest with you guys. Yeah, Rescue Ace Snake Eyes, while I still think it is a really strong deck, and yes, plays really well into Max C, and your odds of being able to imperm the Turbulence with IP in the format are pretty low. The thing is, this deck still runs a lot of non-engine cards that you need to run to get your payoff. I'm talking about all those traps and spells that you're running for Rescue Ace that don't really like serve you going first. So a lot of the time you'll be drawing those traps and you will not be drawing combo. You can get some really awkward hands when you're playing Rescue Ace. And then the fact that they put the Airlifter to 2, meaning that your absolute best normal summon in the deck is now at 2 when you have way lower odds of drawing it, is really, really rough. Not to mention all the other hits too, like just the Snake Eyes engine in general also affect Rescue Ace, right? So like for example, Wanted going to 1 is a pretty big hit actually to Rescue Ace, you know, so those hits end up affecting Rescue Ace as well. So I do feel like I overestimated this deck last time. I did put it in tier 1, and I want to admit I was wrong. It's not tier 1. I still think it's tier 2. I still think it's a really, really strong deck. Don't get me wrong. I just think I definitely overestimated it last time. Still, not a bad pick by any means, and you absolutely can get to Master 1 with this deck. But I'd say it plays better into Maxi than even Tier Limit. So that's a pretty big deal. But anyway, moving on. Got a lot of decks that I want to put in Rogue, so I'm going to start attacking those a little bit here. I think Nuria Horus is a Rogue deck right now. You know, don't sleep on Nuria Horus. It's still good. You can just go watch my last deck profile on it from a while back because the deck didn't really change much. You know, yeah, we lost Calamity. Doesn't matter. Now our game plan is more straightforward. We don't even have to think about level 12 synchros. We don't even care about level 12 synchros actually in this deck. You know, it just it plays super great into Max C, which is a big reason I think that it's really good. It has good control. It doesn't put up crazy big bodies, which actually is a pretty big deal because putting up massive bodies is a pretty big weakness when it comes to facing Ubel. And you know, it sets up some really strong interruption. Infinite spell negates is massive this format. It's really, really strong. As you can see, a lot of the best decks in the game right now are using a ton of really important spells. So yeah, Nuria Beast, really, really strong card this format. I think that alone makes it at least Rogue. I'm not putting it above Rogue, however, because it does suffer from sometimes having awkward hands, especially drawing the Sunflower. Just like, that's a really bad Garnet a lot of the time. And you know, there's also just the fact that the ceiling isn't always crazy high. It can be high if you have like a good hand, but sometimes your hand is not amazing and your ceiling is like a Nuria Beast and like a Linkuriboh plus like 2 monster negates on opponent's turn, which by no, it's not bad, you know, it's strong, but it's not necessarily game winning. Also, a lot of decks can just straight up go beat over Nuria Beast pretty easily. So like that's also kind of an issue. So yeah, I'm not putting it higher than this, but I do think it's kind of slept on. I think it's a good deck. Maybe even better than this, honestly, like low-key, but whatever. I'll leave it here. All right, this one's kind of a tough one. I like never see this, but let's just do pure Kashtira. Now, most of the time, if you're seeing Kashtira in this game, it is not the Kashtira deck. It is Kashtira cards in tier limit, or it's Kashtira cards in pure Snake Eyes, which is not the same as this one. It will be on the list, don't worry. But yeah, usually when you see Kashtira, it's one of those. So it's very, very rare that you actually see pure Kashtira, but a lot of people still do play it. I think one cool thing about Kashtira is it's actually a very beginner-friendly deck, or like it's friendly to people returning to Yu-Gi-Oh! Because its game plan is pretty straightforward. You know, it has a solid turn 2 all in all. It's a strong deck, but it has lost quite a bit of consistency with Unicorn going to 1. So yeah, I don't think it's like the best situated deck ever. I also think Dimensional Fissure, while it is really strong against Tier Limit and Fire King, Dimensional Fissure doesn't do much against Ubel, which does kind of hold a deck like this back. You know, like activating Shifter or activating D-Fissure doesn't really stop you from getting a pretty strong board established in Ubel. So for that reason, I'm going to leave it here. I still think it's good. Not much else to say about Kashtira, honestly. We're just going to move on. All right, so this next deck here is pretty much always Rogue, so I might as well just do it right now. Heroes are Rogue. Big surprise, big freaking surprise, right? Heroes are Rogue. You could also call it a combo stun because you do a combo to set up a skill drain and potentially a Imperial Order, depending on the build that you're playing. It's strong. It has really good combos, has good consistency, has a ton of gas. And if you don't know what to negate, you know, you might be in trouble. Now, every hero player always tells me, just negate Vion and you win. And I'm going to tell you right now, every time I negate Vion, that doesn't win me the game. That almost never wins me the game. So if that's really, I think there might be some type of conspiracy where hero players are just lying to everyone about what you're supposed to negate. And that's why I end up losing to them so much. But they're low-key the ops. Like, I lose to this deck all the time. They're also really, really good going second with a ton of gas to be able to play through interruption. I think it's a really, really solid rogue deck with some pretty big choke points. Next up, let's do some more rogue. You know, let's just, we got to knock them out. I got a lot of rogue decks in here. So we'll do these two at the same time because they are here for the exact same reason. And that would be Raid Raptors as well as Blackwing. Basically, with the new Raid Raptor support, both of these decks have become Kali Yuga machines. They make Kali Yuga extremely easily. That being said, just negating Raid Raptors, no, his name is Raider's Knight. So negating Raider's Knight oftentimes will just kill the Kali Yuga line. I'd say, like, low-key, maybe the Blackwing variant of Kali Yuga is actually maybe even stronger, but I only have, like, one person that I know that plays Blackwing, and that would be High Niner, who got to Master 1 like in a day when the support came out. So that's the main reason I'm including Blackwings in here. So shout out to High Niner. And I will say, you know, Kali Yuga is a hell of a card. It's Calamity Lock, right? You can't sleep on Calamity Lock, but Ubel does not care about towers. And both of these decks, the only thing they do other than Kali Yuga locking is pretty much dropping some big ass towers on the field. And yeah, Ubel is just going to smack into those towers and win the game. They have a really bad matchup into Ubel overall, I would say. Again, I'm not even convinced that Blackwing is worst. Part of me thinks Blackwing might actually be better, but I'm just going to go off of the fact that I've seen Raid Raptor more, and I'm going to put Blackwing below it. But yeah, give me your thoughts in the comments about this. But yeah, I do think this deck might actually be better. But anyway, we're going to move on from this. Towers into Ubel format, not good. Let's move on. We got Dino Morphia over here. And oh my god, my list is getting really tight. I'm going to put Dino Morphia at the bottom of Rogue. The thing about Dino Morphia is, yeah, you know, it's solid when it gets established. It's really, really hard to beat. But, yeah, all your Ubel monsters have 0 attack. So because the monsters are all at 0 attack, that basically means Rexterm can't negate them. And since you can't negate the monsters, and they can just smack into Rexterm, which is a massive body, and just go for game, that means this deck has a really, really bad matchup into Ubel, and that's a big deal. It's not even a kind of bad matchup. It's a really bad matchup. Also, I mean, it's not like Labyrinth, right? Labyrinth can kind of play on turn 0, and, you know, that's kind of crazy. Also, like, Labyrinth in general is just a better going second deck, I would say, than Dino Morphia. So, yeah, I cannot put Dino Morphia any higher, but I do think it's a real deck that you can consider. You know, it's not a bad deck by any means. I always lose to it, honestly. Almost every time I face Dino Morphia, I lose to it. So I have to include it. But yeah, it does have some pretty big downsides. Now, I'm not speaking from experience here. I was just talking to Scorp on my Discord, who has played a good amount of Dino Morphia, and he was kind of giving me his reasoning for it, mostly because, like, I mean, I really can't speak for Dino Morphia. I have never really, like, been a Dino Morphia player like that, you know? But yeah, so that's it for Dino Morphia. Next up, we can do, you know what? Let's do Pearly. I think Pearly is like at the bottom of tier 3. Yeah, I do think it's under Floowandereeze, which might look a little bit weird. The thing is, like, both of these decks, they really don't like Droll. There are hands where you can play through Droll with Pearly, whereas I guess Floowandereeze kind of hard loses to Droll. But even despite that, I mean, Floowandereeze doesn't care about Max C. Pearly absolutely does. I know people love to pretend that Pearly doesn't care about Max C. That is not true. If you activate a flash spell and then your opponent activates Max C, you have a play around Max C, which is to activate another flash spell, and then you have to discard a card to get a summon out of your deck. So you're going like -2 just to stop your opponent from drawing 1 card. Or if you really want to fully commit, you can activate 2 more flash spells and discard 2 cards and actually just completely empty your hand to get 2 summons without giving your opponent 2 draws. But then at that point, like if your opponent has any hand traps other than Maxi, like you completely lost, right? Like you have no chance. Like Imperm on Noir, for example, can be totally game winning. Whereas like with Floowandereeze, now they have those 6 flash spells that allow them to dodge after a normal summon. So like if you have Imperm or Veiler into Floowandereeze, there's a high likelihood that after you activate them, they can just dodge, right? So yeah, I feel like Floowandereeze and Pearly are both similar in the sense that when they get established turn 1, they're extremely strong and they have a good amount of consistency at getting established. But then there's the fact that Floowandereeze doesn't care about Maxi, and also the fact that both of these decks are pretty damn bad at going second. Like I think Pearly and Floowandereeze are just downright atrocious at going second. Like I know like Pearly has tools technically, like they have, you know, happiness and stuff like that, but really with the resources, the fact that every time you activate a card you have to discard a card with the flash spells and everything, like you should, against Pearly, if you're established, you should be able to completely stop them from basically doing anything if you have any clue what you're doing, which is definitely going to be the case if you're playing in master rank. So I just don't think it's a very well situated deck overall. But yeah, well, that's not true. I do think it's still a very, very strong option. I just don't think it's quite as well situated as it was in past formats with the popularity of Duel and just, you know, the fact that big tower monster Ubel, not good. And next up, let's do Pure Snake Eyes. I think it's better than the Rescue Ace variant. Pure Snake Eyes really just means Snake Eyes with Kashtira cards right now, and usually they're gonna pass on. They're gonna like set up the Formula Synchron to be able to make Baron de Fleur on your turn. If they go absolutely full gas combo, they'll actually get a Savage and a Baron and also the IP and all this stuff, right? So it can be really, really terrifying to go up against this deck. It technically has a higher ceiling than the Fire King Snake Eyes variant. The problem is that it plays worst into Max C, and also just generally has like worse consistency now that the Snake Eyes aspect of the deck has been hit so much. The Fire King aspect of this deck helps it tremendously at still getting established when, you know, your Snake Eyes stuff gets ashed or if you just didn't draw into it. So yeah, I still think it's a really, really strong deck. Obviously, it's high tier 2. You know, well-situated deck, super strong option. There's really not like a mile separating decks in tier 2 from decks in tier 1 right now. I actually think we're in a pretty good format in terms of like the amount of decks you can play that are going to perform well. Like, I don't think the decks in tier 3 are necessarily going to do poorly or anything like that. I think you're going to do great with pretty much every single one of these decks. It's just going to be a bit more of an uphill battle with the ones maybe in like tier 3 and slightly so in tier 2. But honestly, in tier 2, it's not going to feel that much different. These decks are insanely strong. The deck that I'll put at the bottom of tier 2 is Labyrinth. And we're going to end the list on Labyrinth. I actually also had Salamangreat, but we ran out of space. So I'll just tell you right now, I was going to put Salamangreat right here under Cash. I think Salamangreat is a strong rogue deck, but weaker than MATHMEECH in pretty much every way, other than the fact that, you know, it can make use of Promethean, I guess. It's still a solid deck. So, you know, if you're a Salamangreat fan, just know that I would have put it here, but we ran out of space, so I'll just not put it on the list at all. But yeah, back to Labyrinth, the deck that we're ending the video on. Yeah, so I mean, this is still obviously the best trap deck in the game. Last tier list, I put it at the top of tier 2, and I don't think I considered very well what I was doing when I did that, because there's a lot of things going against Labyrinth right now. It's not to say that it doesn't have tools. It is a very, very strong deck. Definitely the best trap deck in the game, and the only trap deck that can go second insanely well, and in fact just straight up play on turn 0. The thing is, Labyrinth, not the biggest fan of Ubel. You know, a lot of your Labyrinth effects trigger from popping. You know, a lot of the stuff you do is popping cards, and you don't want to destroy Ubel monsters because obviously you'll get to trigger their floating effects and stuff like that. So because of that, you kind of need to get into your Daruma Cannon to really counter Ubel. And to be fair, Daruma Cannon really hard counters Ubel. So it's not that Labyrinth has no answers, but that is a pretty big deal. There's also, like, you know, the typical issues with Labyrinth, like the fact that they are still very susceptible to Ash Blossom. Like, yeah, rollback is a card, but this is not a deck like Paleozoic where, like, you know, you're just milling your deck for rollbacks. You won't always see rollback in the grave, and not every build runs rollback either. So I don't really think you can use rollback as a way to say that this deck isn't weak to Ash. It is weak to Ash, and because of that, I do think it's like the lowest of their tier 2s. It's also just the fact that it's a trap deck. you know, you really want to win that coin flip and go first, even though you have a good going second turn. Generally speaking, relative to other trap decks, it's still not nearly as good of a going second turn as any of the decks above it, and even most of the decks below it. It has a better going second turn than like stun, obviously, and honestly probably a better going second turn than these two decks, just because a lot of decks right now don't set up a lot to stop back row, so going second and just, you know, just setting a couple of cards can be really strong. But if you're going second and you mostly have like labyrinth monsters or stuff like that, it actually might be a lot harder to get established going second. So yeah, it's a good deck. It's very solid, don't get me wrong. I think if you pick Labyrinth, you know, you're probably already past Master 1 at this point, because it is such a strong deck. Just, in my opinion, not quite as good as the ones above it. You could maybe make an argument that it's better than Rescue Ace Snake Eyes. I personally don't think so. But, you know, I was literally saying this deck was tier 1 last tier list. So maybe my gauge on Rescue Ace is just a little messed up. So either way, that's the tier list pretty much, guys. I really appreciate the time that you took to watch the video. Sorry I haven't uploaded a lot in the past week. I mean, you might be watching this way later and you literally don't give a shit. But yeah, you know, we're back on the grind. We're back on the content grind. I just exited out of my... Thanks for watching the video.